Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much for being here on a Friday night. I feel like that's a big ask of a Vermont crowd, but especially because it's like 17 degrees outside, and that means you have to go outside at some point. But I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for being here. I really love this store, and I think that Vermont is so lucky to have bookstores like it. So it's really important and special for me to be here too. So thank you. I also appreciate that I'm standing underneath a sign that says toddler books because when I was first thinking about the idea for this book and when I first pitched it to the press, I was thinking about it in terms of play and how kids play so naturally. And I was talking to the editor at Melville House and I was like, I've been interested in whatever the adult equivalent of play is. And I don't know what we call that. And the more I started to think about it, the more I came up with this analogy that, play is to children as hanging out is to adults. And that's kind of the closest we come as adults to letting loose and playing like we did when we were kids. So I got really interested in the subject and wrote this book, Hanging Out, The Radical Power of Killing Time, which came out a year ago in hardback and then was just published in paperback last week. And it's been expanded with a new afterword. So I'm going to read a little bit tonight from the new afterword because it's some of the most Vermont-centric content in the book. And here I am with a bunch of Vermonters, so it seems appropriate. I recently spent an afternoon at the end of the world. It happened in Seattle. I was visiting my family there, just as I do most summers. My partner Dave was with me, and so was my mother. She was clinging to my arm when the three of us stepped forward into a dark, misty void where the air around us smelled acrid and briny and suggestive of ruin. For the first few moments, we just stood there, huddling near the threshold and close to the memory of light. It was all we could do while we waited for our eyes to adjust. Then, as they did, we started to explore the space around us. What we found were bodies, people. Some of them were standing, some of them were propped against the walls, and some were splayed out on the floor, corpse-like. We picked our ways around and over them at first, and then we joined them. In a far corner, I got to my knees and I helped my mother, who's in her 70s, into a sitting position. Then I stretched out on the floor as I had seen others doing, and she and Dave did the same thing. We stared upward at a faint beam of light that was spattered with moving shadow. It would come and go, undulating, fading, and then surging forth before cutting out completely again. In the moments when it shone most brightly, I could see the others there in the room. There must have been 20 or 30 of them. But then they would disappear again, and I would be left alone or seemingly alone in a quick privacy of darkness. All the while, sound stalked the space. It grew from a deep swelling of bass that migrated in a rush throughout the room, filling it from end to end. And then came a storm of sonic textures, tearing, scratching, digging, shredding, burning. I could hear wild dogs rooting amongst debris and nervous human whispers. Finally, these sounds subsided and were replaced by a choir. It sang in an unknown language and moved haltingly from a series of minor chords to at last a major one, sounding a note of shy hope. Above the choir, a falsetto voice floated lightly, like sun on water. The whole thing took about 25 minutes. Dave, my mother, and I stayed longer, though, enough to watch the cycle unfold multiple times, and others around us did too, electing to bear witness to an end that seemed to have no end, that just kept coming. The first time through, I surprised myself by crying. The tears ran into my ears and my hair as I lay there on the floor, wedged between the bodies of two people I love. I cried over a simulated experience of profound loss. I had mislaid the world I knew. I was floating in space. I was buried underground. I was cloistered in the hold of a ship and set adrift and rocking on the waves. And then as the cycle started over once more, I gradually regained my awareness of my actual surroundings. I was in a room, a familiar one. I could feel the carpet beneath me. It hadn't been there a few Christmases before when I'd visited the same room to view the works of a 19th century painter on display there. Back then it had been polished hardwood to match the gleaming gilt frames of the paintings. But now it was darkness and smoke and bodies, including that of a man in a Seahawks jersey who was seated in half lotus position just across from me. From my vantage point in the corner, I could watch others arrive and enter into the void. They would stumble in and stand there as I had stood there, struck dumb by the darkness, which for me had grown less threatening and more familiar. And then as the bass tones announced another cycle beginning, I helped my mother to her feet, collected her purse from the floor, and the three of us wound back through the sea of bodies toward the bright July day that was waiting for us outside. The occasion for this sojourn to the end of the world was, in reality, an art exhibit called Flod by the Icelandic multimedia artist Jónsi, which was designed for site-specific presentation at the National Nordic Museum in Seattle. I didn't know it at the time, but I actually experienced the whole thing in the wrong order. The combination of light, sound, and scented fog, as Yancey explains in interviews, is actually supposed to start with the hopeful choir part and end with the violent destruction part. What starts out as, quote, 16 voices distributed individually across speakers becomes, quote, a big wave, as he tells it. The voices are drowned by the wave and then replaced by a mix of field recordings and textures, as he calls them, all of it serving as a metaphor for rising seas brought about by climate change. Yancey, who is also the lead singer of the post-rock band Sigur Rós, says that the installation grew out of his own fixation on, quote, the big wave and how we're all going to die and everything is going to flood. The idea was to become engulfed, it seemed, not to emerge. But that's not how I experienced it. Rather, because my entrance into the gallery had coincided with the initial moment of destruction in the loop, what was supposed to exist before came afterwards for me. The voices of the choir rose out of the frenzy of sonic texture instead of the other way around. Seen in this way, the exhibit spoke not only of despair, but also of hope, of struggle, and of something new spluttering to life. The fact that Yancey devised the piece as a loop actually invites this kind of inverse reading. Without the benefit of clear endings and beginnings, the viewer is forced to discover entrances and exits in the piece for herself and to craft her own version of a story that might fall somewhere between those poles. This was what we were all doing there, the 20 or 30 of us who rested and cried and looked and heard and hung out inside of the space of the Float exhibit. We were devising stories from the disjointed wreckage of sensory experience, trying to make meaning from it all. We were doing it separately, in accordance with our own logic and guided by our own subjective impressions, but we were doing it together. We were giving ourselves over to an experience of collective undoing, of mass fragility. I carried that feeling of mass fragility with me when I left the exhibit. It clung to me a bit like how my mother had clung to my arm for balance when we were inside it. I thought about what it meant to have hung out without conversation and with little shared acknowledgement in that space of a simulated disaster. I thought about the guy in the Seahawks jersey, about the cautious way that we would eye each other, saw each other, and because the exhibit encouraged me to, I compared my impressions of it to real disasters, both hypothetical and otherwise. About 3 weeks before I'd left for Seattle, you see, my home state of Vermont had flooded. It all started with rain that fell and fell, 2 whole uninterrupted days worth of rain. And even as I write this some months later, or as I did write it back in August, the flood and its aftermath is still very much with us in Vermont, although this part is still kind of true. The public high school in Montpelier, where I gather on Tuesday nights with other bagpipers, a precious experience when you play a weird instrument like the bagpipes, has only recently reopened its doors to us. Only weeks ago, there were still FEMA trailers in its parking lot. Its ground floor was entirely submerged in the July floods. And the same goes for much of downtown Montpelier. Its district has yet to regain a sense of normalcy, and many of the businesses there are still closed. The bar where the summer before I sat and talked about hanging out and a book called Hanging Out with a friend over some fries and lunch beers, the same bar where I had dinner with a long-lost college friend who I hadn't seen in 15 years, but who showed up to a reading I was doing at a local library, is still closed. All over the state, the rivers and waterfalls, where I enjoy swimming each summer, continue to run high, which prevented me from going near them. The Intervale Community Farm, where I do my volunteering, which saw 99% of its land submerged in the flood, had to temporarily halt its CSA program. The flower farm next door, where Dave and I danced on the grass at a concert back in June amid zinnias and black-eyed Susans, was a welter of mud. I talk a lot about space in Hanging Out because space is one of the essential ingredients required for social activity. In the wake of the Vermont floods, though, I was thinking not just about the scarcity of space, the spaces that foster such activity, but also about the constant vulnerability that defines them even when they manage to exist for us. The Float exhibit in Seattle nudged all of this thinking one step further. It brought me face to face with the prospect, indeed the virtual experience, of their total erasure. Crisis can bring about a much-needed confrontation with community. It's not the best or the most desirable way to hang out, obviously, but it's one way that hanging out does happen. Rebecca Solnit, in a book she wrote on the subject of communities that form in the wake of crisis, observes this, noting how, quote, disaster requires an ability to embrace contradiction in both the minds of those undergoing it and those trying to understand it from afar. In each disaster, there's suffering, there are psychic scars that would be felt most when the emergency is over, there are deaths and losses, but there are also satisfactions, newborn social bonds, liberations. In Seattle, while lying on a carpet surrounded by the prostrate bodies of loved ones and strangers alike, I thought about hypothetical floods, future floods and also about real floods. Back when I lived in North Dakota, for example, it was in a town where some decades before I arrived there, flooding had prompted the largest evacuation of an American population since the Civil War. On my regular runs through the downtown district, I would pass by the flood monument, which takes the form of a giant sandstone and concrete pillar rising beside the river that was once the cause of the town's suffering. It marks the high water point from the 1997 disaster, 54.35 feet. I would pause at its base and look up and imagine the glint of light reaching toward me through all that water. In October 2019, when coastal hurricanes pushed heavy rains inland and delivered them to the Midwest, Dave and I mucked out our basement, along with our neighbors. The whole street passed shop vacs around and helped to drag heavy rolls of waterlogged carpet out of houses, piling them on berms alongside broken furniture and strips of muddy flooring. And then again, in the spring of 2020, as the COVID pandemic descended on us, Dave and I found ourselves running a monotonous figure eight through our neighborhood in North Dakota because the river, having jumped its banks yet again, was blocking our running route. We couldn't trace our normal path to the old flood monument because we were dealing with a flood of our own. I have lived with floods and also with their historical scars. I have walked streets that were born anew because of water, and likewise those that were decimated by it, rinsed of the things, homes and businesses and parks and trees that once made them so livable. And I've stood on bridges in the company of neighbors and friends and strangers and watched the water go thundering past. Annie Dillard, in her classic work, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, writes memorably about a similar experience that rocked her rural Virginia community. Quote, neighbors who have barely seen each other all winter are out there shaking their heads, staring at the water. Few have ever seen it before. It's running over the bridge, she writes, noting how the spectacle of rising water has drawn people out of their homes. This is the thing about weather, which is also the thing about water. When it comes for everyone, and thus creates ready-made forms of connection and instant topics of conversation. It shouldn't take a flood in order to hang out, but sometimes that's exactly what it takes. One of the things that came out of the 1997 flood in Grand Forks, North Dakota, was the creation of a brand new town square. Decades later is that town square where I first met my friend, who became a reality TV star, who I talk about in the book. I attended town dances in that square. I attended farmers markets in that square. I did yoga in that square as part of a town-wide yoga wellness week. And though I do not ice skate, I watched ice skaters there every December when the town officials flooded the square on purpose this time so it would freeze and form a rink. Thank you. So I'm happy to take any questions, or if you have a thought to share or anything that comes to your mind about hanging out or floods, goodness knows, or anything that happens to be on your mind tonight. Don't be shy. Get the party started, Jess. Yeah, sure thing. So I was thinking about hanging out before the COVID pandemic came along, believe it or not, but then the COVID pandemic came along and I was not doing any hanging out at all. And that forced me to think a lot more about it. And one of the places that I began in thinking about it was the concept of parties. So the first chapter in the book is called Hanging Out at Parties. And one of the reasons I was interested in parties was I was kind of noticing this like cultural anxiety about parties, and how for many people I know, including many of the students I teach, there's a kind of excitement about parties. Parties are fantasies, they're wish fulfillment, but there's also a nervousness. And there's a whole sector of the population, a good size of them, of people who hate parties. And so I was interested in that. You know, what's going on here? What are we nervous about? Why do we feel anxious about that? And in the book, I tell a story about being at a party where I suddenly found myself to feel like I didn't want to be there. And it was a party where I came to the mutual discovery that the person who invited me also maybe didn't want me there. and it made this kind of interesting, awkward interaction where we ended up like kind of confessing this to each other. This was a colleague that I worked with previously when I was living in North Dakota, and she was leaving her job and leaving the place where I worked. And so we were kind of having a goodbye party. And I'd never really known her that well or gotten along with her, but she invited me because she invited everyone. And then at the party, we kind of like got in this discussion together, and we were just kind of like good nature bantering, a little bit and having a kind of fun argument, or I thought it was fun. And then at one moment, she just kind of turned to me and she's like, "Why are you even here?" And I was like, "Because you invited me." And then I realized that was the only reason I was there. I didn't even want to be there. So it was this interesting moment where I kind of like called a spade, and she did too. And that got me thinking about like what it is that we're doing when we throw parties, when we attend parties, when we have them, but also maybe when we try to avoid them sometimes, and why we have that anxiety surrounding those events in our life. So that was an initial point of getting into this subject. And then I started to thinking about all the ways that we try to hang out in modern culture. So in the book, I talk about parties, I talk about dinner gatherings. I also talk about hanging out with strangers and trying to find comfort or companionship with strangers and how hard that can be. And I also talk about hanging out at work, what it's like to make friends on the job. I used to work as a bartender, so I talk a lot about how a bartender's job is really to hang out with people and give them company sometimes. And I talk about other forms of compensatory hanging out, including hanging out on television, what we do when we watch people hanging out on TV through reality TV, and then also hanging out on the internet as well, which is something that most of us do a decent amount of these days.
Yeah. That seems like a good segue into something you probably cover in the book. But like in our book club, we tried Zooming for book club. It was an epic fail. It's not the
You
same.
should try Zooming for bagpipes, which is all but impossible. Yes.
Failing us at work when we are still doing it, but I can't quite figure out why.
Well, I think it's a combination of things. One, I think for many of us, the Zoom environment just feels kind of artificial, especially if we're used to being in that environment for other reasons, whether it's work or whether it's, telehealth or whatever we happen to be doing. If we're used to kind of associating that action with a different kind of activity, I think sometimes it takes on that stain of that other activity. But I also, when I'm on Zoom, I often notice the silence that happens, because it's not like in a conversation in person where you can like sort of find the moments in the conversation and find your way in. And what I tend to notice is that people try that at first, and then it gets weird or frustrating or awkward, and they just give up and don't say anything. And then it just gets really quiet. And one thing that tends to happen, I think, in video chats and Zoom is that somebody will end up making up for the silence of others, right? Somebody will jump in and try to fill that space, and it ends up feeling not very equal between the participants. So it's a very frustrating format. It's all we had for a while, and I'm glad we had it. But yeah, it's no substitute for the kind of hanging out that we do in person, right? Yeah. But bagpipes, wow, they're so rough on Zoom. During the pandemic, I was hired to play a couple of funerals over Zoom, and so I would like play bagpipes live, like in my living room, for like a group of people who are all separate, observing the life of somebody who had passed away, which was a very, very strange experience. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
One hand, you could argue that people that are otherwise isolated,
Right. Yeah. Definitely, yes. In the chapter that I call Hanging Out on the Internet, I talk about the difference between the behaviors that we develop when we hang out online versus face to face. And, I do label that a kind of compensatory behavior, and I think that there are good things to it. I try not to be too harsh on the idea of hanging out in social media spaces, because for some people, I know they're really, really important. And they were really important to me. I mentioned that when I moved to North Dakota, which I did in 2014 to start a job working at a university there, I didn't know anyone. I'd never been to the state before, and I didn't have any friends. And I was living in like a small college town, and I opened my first social media account about 4 months into that job so that I could have water cooler conversation basically with people, who were kind of like me. So that was, something that was very, very beneficial to me at the time. But I think one of the downsides that we have to think about when it comes to hanging out on the internet or social media are those behaviors that we develop, and how easy it is in digital spaces to walk away from things that make us uncomfortable, to either like close the window or block someone or just like put the phone down and go away and do something else. And those are things that we can't get away with doing face to face, at least not without social consequences. And I think it makes for a different kind of dynamic when we're interacting in person. If we try to carry over those behaviors from those digital spaces to in-person interactions, things get kind of awkward. And I notice this, of course, with my students again all the time because, I spend a lot of my days around people aged 18 to 24 years old. And I notice, for instance, like when they come into a classroom and it's dead silent in a classroom and they're all sitting there together and they have things in common, right? Like they're all here, they're the same age, they're in Burlington, Vermont, they're registered for the same class, they have similar interests, but they're on their phone talking to somebody else, right? Who is somewhere else. And I know why. It's easier to do that. They know that someone else is going to support them or agree with them or something like that, give them that kind of sustenance, social sustenance. And they don't know about the person sitting next to them. That guy's a wild card. Who knows how that's going to go? So I think sometimes it's, a sort of known comfort over an unknown quantity that we see. But I don't think that, of course, social media should take the place of in-person interactions. I think it's really important for us to continue to cultivate those as well. Other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
I wanted to say that I also think there's other ways that we communicate with each other, but not only not verbal or visual,
Yeah.
but energetic.
Yeah, right,
Just
right.
all of those things that happen that I don't think they're necessarily that they're not happening.
Right.
I don't think that you get that if you're not seeing the
Yeah.
person.
Yeah. That emotional signal that we send out through our body language,
Yeah.
in terms of like what we're trying to communicate, but also what we need from that other person in the moment. I think of this moment years ago, and I talk about this friend a little bit in the book. This is a friend I had in North Dakota, and I think about this moment many years ago when she and I were at lunch together, just having this kind of workday lunch. We worked together, but I could tell she had something really big to tell me, and I could see her just kind of like tensing up over lunch and like getting ready to tell me this thing. And I saw it coming before she said it. And the thing she was going to tell me was that she was pregnant, she was having a kid, exciting, and also that she was quitting her job, right? And that was the decision she was making. And so I think she was nervous about telling me that. And so in the moment, I was like watching her body language shift, and I could see it all coming before it happened. And then I was like ready, to greet the news for her sake. So
And I don't think it's just body language. I think maybe we sell anxiety the way
certainly, yeah, yeah,
or when you go into a room sometime and you have this sense that these two people are fighting.
Yeah. You can feel it in the air. Yeah, absolutely.
So, I think that
No, you can't get that over Twitter or even over Zoom, I think, with all that awkward silence. Agreed.
and I wanted also to talk about book club, and it was a very old book club. And it's
Book clubs are one of my favorite ways of hanging out. I fully support.
Well, I'm like the oldest person in the book club now, and so a lot of the last time that we tried to get together, we sent out something that was somebody with more online sent out something that was like a Google, like a Google scheduler, Google Meet
Right.
or something,
Right.
Meetup kind of thing. Yeah.
The
And
little,
so
the invitation thing.
And so you sent out this thing, and everybody checked, which days they could make it, and then, which times of days, and then, and I just thought to myself, wow, who's hanging out in that situation?
I know.
I mean, if your schedule is that, just blew me away.
Yeah.
Because I like hanging out.
I do too. I like hanging out too. And it's also something that I think in order to be done right, it needs to have a little bit of casualness and open-endedness to it, And I talk in the book about, the situation that we live in the world of being hyper-scheduled, where so much of our day is scheduled down to the minute or something like that. And so, you'll make an appointment with your friend and you're like, well, I can slot you in for 30 minutes exactly here, right? And then when that 30 minutes is up, it's like a timer's gone off. It's like, well, my GCal is telling me I got to move on to something. So, and one thing I noticed interestingly during the pandemic is how, we were having these friend chats on Zoom in the beginning. I don't know if you guys remember early pandemic when everybody's like, wow, this new technology, let me talk to somebody I haven't talked to in 10 years by seeing their face. And one thing I thought was so interesting was I noted a natural kind of like, this meeting should be exactly this length, even though it didn't need to be. And this like self-selecting then to like pull out of the meeting after say an hour. It's like, well, that's the accepted length for how long we hang out together or something like that. So it's like we were policing ourselves almost in those same ways, even without the calendars. Yes. You are not in trouble. It's totally fine. That's what this is for. So.
I'm curious if you talk about kind of like what so many people from, right? Like,
yeah.
Like, because sometimes personally there are times where I make plans with friends and there's a part of me that really wants to like hang out.
Yeah.
And then there's this other part of me that's like, oh my gosh, no, that's way too much. Like now I'm overwhelmed or I don't have the energy to socialize. And obviously that depends on, how social a person you might be.
Yeah.
But they're also obviously like, I'm curious if you like look into factors involved in why people might not.
Definitely. And one of the biggest factors is time, right? If you are living a hyper-scheduled life, then it's very easy, I think, sometimes to see hanging out or any kind of meeting with a friend or something casual like that as like one more thing on your to-do list. And sometimes you get to the end of the day in your incredibly scheduled life and you're like, I can't do that one more thing. But also, I know that person's going to forgive me. I know that I'll have another chance. There's this feeling that like you're going to get another chance some other time. And so it becomes less of a priority. And so, one of the things that I argue for in the book is just that we have a reverse sense of our priorities. And maybe we ought to think about ordering those differently. Thinking about hanging out as being something that is worth kind of seizing the moment for or doing today, as opposed to something that we'll continue to put off or, kick that can down the street a little bit and do it later on. So time is essential, but one of the other big factors that I talk about that I think prevents us from hanging out more is space. And that's one of the things I was kind of talking about there in the afterword. I talk about the diminishment of public space that can be used for hanging out. And here in a northern clime, I think it's all the more difficult because, 6 months out of the year, we can't go out in a town square or a park or something like that. And it becomes even more difficult. So we have to make sure that we fight for the spaces in our community that allow us to do that. And I'm talking about libraries and bookstores and coffee shops and all those places that we can enter into for free or low cost and meet people who we do not share a domestic dwelling with, right? Which is very important to be able to do on a pretty average basis. And the more we do it, the easier it gets, and the more we feel like we couldn't or shouldn't live without it. Yeah.
I have a question about the difference between, I feel like the way that you kind of talk about this is like, there's this idea of kind of the magical hanging out where it comes out. Like, there's a moment, I listened to your book.
Oh, so fantastic. How did you like the audiobook? Was she a good reader?
I enjoyed it.
Okay, good.
But I enjoy your voice so much more.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
There's something about that moment of jamming where there's a section where you're playing music and then suddenly all these people come out of the blue and they're all hanging out, right?
Yeah.
And it's out of the blue and it's kind of unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
And I live in rural Vermont where I feel like I'm always like,
yeah.
I have to be like, and it's almost like I want to have an intentional gathering, but then that removes the kind of the magical, unexpected moment of hanging out. So I'm trying to figure out where do you see this.
I know what you mean, because I mean, on the one hand, I'm celebrating serendipity, right? Like hanging out when you didn't even know you're going to, or you didn't know it was going to happen. So she's referring to a moment that I talk about in the book where I was at this jam session in North Carolina and I was playing with some friends that I played in a band with, and we didn't know, but apparently there actually already had been intentional plans to create this jam session, but we didn't know it. So we're sitting there around this campfire and all these people like emerge out of the woods with instruments because they'd been drawn to the campfire and they'd also been told it was happening, but we didn't know. And I was like, oh my God, it's amazing. It's magic. Here they are. And they know all the same songs as me and we're having such a great time. But, in that case, it felt magical and serendipitous, but it was intentional. Somebody put those plans in order. They just didn't communicate them to the rest of us. And I think the intentional work that goes into planning to create a space or a time to hang out and be with other people is really important. But I also think it's something that we've gotten kind of rusty at. I think if you ask people to come over and hang out with you or to do some sort of like mundane task, they're going to feel like, well, is this worth my time? Should I do that? Is there an objective? Is there an agenda? Can you send it to me, first so I can approve it ahead of time? So I think that's just something that we have to develop greater stamina for. One, taking those opportunities, creating those opportunities. I love that you're trying to plan opportunities in your rural area because that's what you got to do in rural areas. But also to allow ourselves to know the knowledge that like it's not always going to be magical or perfect, and that's totally fine. What we're doing is we're working on creating momentum and routine, right? Where we see each other and where we know the members of our community and where we know what's happening with them. So good for you. Keep it up. Keep it up. Thank you so much, Jess. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to be signing books downstairs for anybody who's interested. Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming.